So great to be here, and really glad to have Dennae here as well. I think we thought we'd maybe just kind of briefly share some additional thoughts since you've all already heard from us a little bit, and then we'd love to have more of a conversation, which so we don't only hear from us, but get to hear more perspectives. So Dennae, if it's okay, I can start and then turn it over to you for a few minutes. Is that good?
Yep, sounds good.
I thought I would maybe, in terms of sort of engaging your church, I would talk through what is sometimes the end of my kind of stock PowerPoint presentation if I have a little bit more time, and that is an acronym of PLEASE. So I don't have a slide on this right now, so you can take notes if you want to, or I could send it to you later. But in terms of, I think it's helpful to sort of think of not even necessarily a progression, because these don't necessarily go in order, but a sort of a menu of ways that churches can be involved in embracing the immigrants in their community. And it's worth noting, often within their churches. I mean, immigration is not an issue outside there in the world. Immigrants are as or more likely to be Christians than the average native-born U.S. citizen. So it's actually an issue within the church very much as well. But the first point there in that acronym of PLEASE is prayer. And that's not just because LEASE wasn't a good acronym, but because we really believe that, engaging any hard issue should start by prayer and be sustained by prayer. And that, I think, specifically, we heard Gracie talking about some of the dynamics that people are fleeing in parts of Central America right now. We should be praying for the conditions that really motivate people to migrate, usually out of a sense of desperation, not only in Central America, but in parts of the world where they can't reach the United States as well, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, all over the world. We should be praying for the immigrants in our communities. We should be praying for our churches, that our response would be that shining city on a hill. And we should be praying for our elected officials. And we're told to pray for kings and all those in authority. So whether you like the president, your senators, your member of Congress or not, we should be praying for them. And especially praying for wisdom and courage as they set policies that have very profound impact on vulnerable people of various kinds. The next letter in the acronym is listening. And I think there's at least two sources we should definitely be listening to. One would be the Bible. And again, I would argue we don't do that enough, particularly on this issue, probably on every issue. But just to mention, there's one resource that we've used for a long time with the Evangelical Immigration Table is a very simple 40-day Bible reading guide. It's on our website, or you can also get it on the Bible.com app, the YouVersion app. So it'll just pop up with a different verse every day of the week for 40 days. One thing that I think has been really helpful about that tool is it intentionally doesn't tell you, I'm going to put this in the chat here. It doesn't tell you what those verses mean, doesn't tell you who to vote for. It's nothing besides the Bible. So if people are sort of defensive at being asked to read Bible verses, I think that actually is something the Holy Spirit might want to work on them with. But it should be a starting point. And then we can discuss, well, how does this apply to our current context? But a lot of people have just had the reaction, I had no idea the Bible said anything about this. Secondly, we should be listening to the stories of immigrants themselves. Again, when it's a relationship that you have, not just an issue you hear about on the news, this issue it becomes much more personal and frankly, much more complex. And so in the church context, that might mean looking at what are ways we intentionally facilitate developing those relationships. And I know Dennae and her team at Surge have done some really innovative things in the Phoenix area. So I'd love for you all to hear more from her about that. The E in that acronym is empowering churches abroad. Again, going to the reality that, our view at World Relief, we want to welcome immigrants whenever we can. But we also think it's a tragedy that there are so many people who felt they had no choice but to leave their home, whether because of violence or war or extreme poverty or some combination thereof. And there's a lot that churches can do. There's certainly a lot that governments can do as well, but there's a lot that churches can do to address those root causes of why people are feeling like their last option is to leave their country. Some of that is, many of the places that people are leaving, Central America is a good example. It's like the most Christian part of Latin America by a number of measures. I mean, about half evangelical, half Catholic in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and also Nicaragua. But there's a lot of local churches doing really heroic work to care for their communities. And there's lots of ways for U.S. churches to come alongside them. And again, that's not true just for Central America, but for our brothers and sisters in Africa and in every other part of the world. The A in that acronym is advocacy. One definition of advocacy is simply from Proverbs 31, verse 8, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all those who are destitute. Now, I always want to caution how we use that passage, because I just told you to listen to the stories of immigrants. So immigrants are not voiceless people who cannot speak for themselves. But it is true that in a democratic form of government, if you're a non-citizen, you cannot vote. And if you cannot vote, the elected officials who set immigration policies are probably not all that interested in what you think. But most of you probably are citizens who can vote. And with that, I think comes not only an opportunity, but also a responsibility, a stewardship, to be advocating, to stand with and elevating the voices of those whose voices are often not heard, with those in positions to change public policies. And I will say, sort of in terms of a plug, one way we've done that for a long time at World Relief is through partnering with the Evangelical Immigration Table, which is a broader coalition that includes the National Association of Evangelicals, the Southern Baptist Ethics and the Religious Liberty Commission, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, World Vision, a bunch of other organizations. Often by just looking at what are some basic principles that we think should be applied to public policy. So you can check that out if that's interesting to you. The S in that acronym is serving locally. There's all sorts of very tangible needs in immigrant communities, and what those needs are, frankly, it's going to depend on what community you're in. And sometimes I see churches, get really excited and say, well, we know exactly what the immigrants in our community need, and they come up with a program, and it's exactly what already exists in the community if they would have, taken the time to ask around. So I'm hesitant to tell you, well, this is the one ministry that, will fit the need that people have. But there's lots of ways. I mean, there's needs for, it's relevant to administer justice. There's huge needs for legal services, obviously accredited legal services by people who either are attorneys and trained in immigration law, because it's a complex area of law, or it's also possible to provide authorized legal services if you get accredited by the U.S. Department of Justice. But beyond that, English language instruction, there's youth mentoring opportunities. And underscoring all that, I think probably the biggest need for a lot of folks, especially those who come from places where there's not a community that they're already arriving to, is friendship. And that's something we see a lot with refugee resettlement. We're often serving families who have basically been uprooted from halfway around the world, and they're landing in an entirely new place, and they may know no one when they arrive. And so our goal at World Relief is they know someone from the moment they arrive, because it's not just their World Relief caseworker there to meet them at the airport, but also a team from a local church. If they want that, I mean, they're always free to turn down having a volunteer support team, but it's very rare, frankly, that they do. And, we think that we ask people to make a 6-month commitment because it's hard to ask church people to commit the rest of their lives. But our not so secret hope is that this becomes a long-term reciprocal relationship that goes on, perhaps right on into eternity. And then, so that's serving locally. The last point in that acronym of PLEASE is evangelism, which I think it's important to make a distinction between evangelism and proselytism. We're not talking about, we will, serve you and love you so long as you pray this prayer or come to our church, or any sort of pressure. And it is important to know with immigration, there's some power dynamics that sometimes we may not even realize. So it's very important to be sensitive to those. But we do believe in evangelism rightly understood, which is an open invitation to a relationship with Jesus. And very often that comes in response to a question. When it is that team from a local church who welcomes a Muslim family at the airport and genuinely loves them as their neighbors without any pretext of, we'll love you conditionally so long as you join us at our church. But when we love people well, we find it's fairly rare that sooner or later there's not a conversation. There's not the question of, oh, why do you love us so well? Why do you love us? And we get to, as 1 Peter 3 says, to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you, and to do so with gentleness and respect. And I will say, on that point of evangelism, and I'll turn it over to Dennae, there's a new book out next month that I just finished reading and really, really valued. It's an edited book with a bunch of authors, but edited by Eugene Cho and Samira Page. And it's really specifically on how to evangelism, how it can be done well, or frankly done not well in immigrant communities. It's a really thoughtful book. So it's called Strangers No Longer. I can find that online too. but I'll put the link in the chat. But that's just a few thoughts, and then maybe I'll turn it over to Dennae, and then we can just have a conversation from there.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the things that we've done in Phoenix is borrowing and using the work that both the evangelical immigration table, as well as the work that Matt's doing. So those are great resources to incorporate into the things that you guys do with whether you're in a local church and you're able to kind of help organize something within your community, or even just with friends. So, the prayer guides that come out, and just having set times throughout the year where you can focus in on this topic and pray, maybe learn, maybe commit with friends to research more, things like that. A couple things that we've done just really practically. One, I talked last night about just the importance of like thinking about our calendar and the rhythms that we're setting up as communities. And so really, at the end of every year, kind of planning out the following year, just different times for campaigns. So Matthew said, that, it's hard to get people to do something permanently or forever, or to stay focused on a topic, but having certain times of the year that you're just going to be really focused in getting as many people as possible organized to pray, to talk about, to advocate, to do some kind of project is really an important way of just bringing new people into the conversation and activating them to be engaged. Another thing we've done is something called Neighbors Table, which if you are not in Phoenix, if you are in Phoenix, I'd love to talk to you more about it. If you're not in Phoenix, we have a model we could share with you if you have a few churches in your city who are interested in putting it together. But essentially, we partner with some churches locally that are predominantly Spanish speaking and lower income. So a lot of undocumented immigrants, a lot of DACA, a lot of immigrant families who have at least one person in their home who's not documented. And there's this whole day we spend together. We hear all about, we kind of go through, tons of scripture on God's heart for the immigrant. What does it mean to welcome the stranger? Hospitality. And then at the end of that teaching, where you it's hard to ignore that we're called to be hospitable. These immigrant families open up their homes to these suburban evangelical families. And they're the ones who show the hospitality. And so we go to different people's, we split up to 30, 40 different houses. There's a meal, we have a translator, and there's 2 hours to share stories together. And then from there, there's a six week curriculum that people walk through, considering their own story of migration, looking at some of the things we talked about in terms of the different narratives that we're living out of. So just, one of the things that the consistent theme is getting people to be in proximity together is super important, but also educating them in terms of history, theology, a gospel narrative that's big enough to hold and motivate neighbor love. And just all these different things are really important as we're also giving people relationship. So we've both discovered there's a huge need for relationship and relationship without teaching, because the paradigms are so strong that we need people to shift out of. If they don't shift out of that paradigm, then actually the relationship can be very hurtful. And early on, we did have a lot of pain toward our immigrant brothers and sisters because we were doing the relationship, and a lot of the church members were not equipped, or even they hadn't been prepared to enter in a with a sense of reciprocity and equality, but it was so transactional. And so we had to go back and really think about how do we equip our church members not to be transactional or the savior of the story, but to really sit as brothers and sisters. And as we've done it, that's been really transformative. We've also been really intentional engaging with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So, being a border state, we have a lot of asylum seekers who've come up, and we've done a lot of emergency housing where, the immigration will say, hey, we need to release 100 people today, and we have 48 hours before they're going to be able to get on the Greyhound to get put with whoever their sponsor is. And so we've had, hundreds of families that have opened up their homes to host people for 24, 48 hours. And that didn't just come out of nowhere, right? We had to have relationships with the different local nonprofits, mostly non-Christian, mostly not run by Christians, but the different nonprofits that had been, serving asylum seekers and for a long time. And so, if you have, depending on where you're living, finding out who are the local leaders already engaged in this work and figuring out how we can mobilize even just a small group of volunteers helps us then have the relationships for when crisis really does grow to be able to be present. And then, I think that last one would be what, Matthew talked about, supporting churches in Central America, in Latin America, in Africa. That I think is really, really important. There's just so much good work happening from the local churches, led by Hondurans, led by, excuse me, there's so much important stuff happening, and being able to find those partnerships and just invest and support is really, really important.
On that point, Dennae, I was talking with a friend who works in Honduras a week or two ago, and she said, there's all the news focus on the Hondurans who are leaving, and we're very empathetic to that situation, but we never talk about the Hondurans who are staying, and the ones who sometimes at, real risk are doing incredible work in their communities. And that's not to judge those who make the determination that I've got to get out, it's too dangerous, or I got to feed my family. But I want to be careful we don't sort of frame the story as this is this terrible place with terrible people. It's a beautiful place with beautiful people working with really challenging circumstances. And that's not just Honduras. That's, there's that everywhere, and often that's led by local churches. So I think what Dennae and I were hoping is we didn't want to just plan an hour and a half of content after you heard us talk at you for so long. So we'd love to have either comments, ideas, questions, and we'll do our best to facilitate that. But you do have to unmute.
Hey, Matt, I got a question or encouragement for you. Can you hear me?
I can. Thanks, Bruce.
This is Bruce Wakefield, Phoenix, Arizona, sitting in my casita, trying to stay warm because the air conditioning's too cold. Hey, on evangelism, that's where my heart is, and I'd like to see what you think. Thank you for that encouragement to not proselytize, just say the sinner's prayer to people. My encouragement is, including Dennae's comments, is whenever we're addressing a physical need like food or bags or clothing, that we include the Word of God through specifically gospel tracts. What I like is they're simple, they're concise. People may want to read them later. They don't want to be taught, let's say, relationally. So I encourage people and churches and evangelists to provide those so people can read them at their leisure. And amazingly, Bruce Strom has a gospel tract called Good News About Justice that's going to be available on the web store at some point. Jules may address that later. It's in Spanish now, which is awesome. And I'm told in Honduras, they can even use that Spanish dialect. But it can be ordered, it can be used. I just think it's important as we address the physical needs of anyone, we address the spiritual needs. And a concise, simple John 3:16, a Romans 6:23 word booklet is provided in all those situations. And then if conversations are started, which many are, when people need legal advice, it's a great tool if people want to continue the conversation to the gospel, to Jesus beyond justice.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would also say maybe even on like the flip side of that, one of the things that's been really helpful about not just getting involved, but then helping individuals know how to bring their circle of friends into this work is that a lot, especially Central America, as Matthew was saying, a lot of the asylum seekers are passionate Christians. And so as we've had people open up their homes, the amount of stories we've heard of people who have, had a father and a son crack open their Bible and just, praise God that the one possession that made it all the way through the journey was his Bible from junior high, and just the stories that we've heard of just the American church's need for conversion. So, as you're talking about evangelism, I think there's like this dual role of like getting Americans to think about their circle of friends and their sphere of influence and integrating them into this work, because a lot of the gospel is coming from Latin America. And especially this, especially the gospel that includes God's heart for the poor and challenges a lot of our idolatry. And so even as you're thinking about legal aid to individuals that you're providing services for, what are lawyers or different people in your life that that just need to be in the presence of these refugees, these immigrants, asylum seekers, and how God might use their story and their testimony to soften hearts of kind of the American culture that's very hard-hearted right now. But yeah, I think there's endless opportunities in this work specifically to expose people to the gospel, both in word and deed.
I think that's so important, Dennae, because it is a two-way street. And sometimes we forget that on one way direction or the other, but in the US context, usually it's the presumption is we've got the gospel and they don't. And sometimes that's true. I mean, there are unreached people groups who show up in the United States in a context of religious freedom, which is amazing because they came from contexts where they would be unlikely to ever encounter the gospel. And if they did, they would be putting themselves at risk of persecution to embrace Jesus, as would anyone trying to share it with them. So that God has in his sovereignty brought people from all those places to the United States is, I think, an incredible opportunity. At the same time, it's important to know that, more immigrants are already self-described Christians than those who are not. And many of them, as you said, are very passionate believers who have a lot to bring to the American church, and not just the American church, but to American society, which is not a Christian society in so many ways. I mean, there are so many people here who don't really know Jesus, and immigrants are in some ways bringing with them the gospel. I've had the same experience, some of the work you're all doing in Phoenix. I spent some time along the border, mostly on the Mexican side, in churches, really incredible Mexican churches that are hosting. Basically, they've turned their whole sanctuaries into shelters, which is a little, it's a good, appropriate challenge to when we bring suburban church partners down from all over the United States, and they realize, wow, this pastor hasn't had an office in 2 years because he turned it into bunk beds for these Central American families coming through, or Haitian families, or Cuban families, even some from Africa who made it all the way to Ecuador and all the way up through Latin America. And many of those people have just such a profound sense of faith in God's provision that honestly, I'm not always, it's a tension point for me, because I want to make sure they have sort of a sober understanding of the legal realities in front of them, but they are just so sure that God is going to provide for them. And I want to affirm that. And at the same time, advise them some of the legal dynamics they're coming into. But I mean, my experience has been very often, especially with the Central Americans, you offer to pray with them and then they turn around and pray for you for like half an hour. And it's, a very vibrant prayer, and they have learned to rely on God in a way that, frankly, I don't always rely on God, and I need to be challenged as well.
On that note, Matt or Dennae, would you share an experience like that, where being proximate, being in relationship, where an immigrant blessed you or showed you some of the character of God? So do you have any stories or examples that you would like to share about that?
Well, I can start. I mean, I've shared the story, and I may have shared this publicly before, but this is years ago. There was a family that arrived in our neighborhood. They were from East Africa. They're Christians. They were seeking asylum, not coming to the border, but they got tourist visas. And then there's a political situation in their country. It's so sensitive that they told me I can share their story, just don't say what country they're from. They're still, years from that experience, they're a little bit nervous about that. But anyway, they became good friends. We kind of helped. They didn't come as refugees. So the World Relief didn't know they were here. We didn't meet them at the airport. We didn't know that. So we just kind of stumbled upon them in this neighborhood where I was living. And, asked some friends to help get some literally air mattresses was like what we could find when they first showed up, because they just had nothing. And eventually the mom won her asylum claim, which is not easy. So that was in itself sort of an answer to prayer and felt like a miracle. As time went by, they didn't need a lot of like help anymore. They just were our friends, which is kind of what we're aiming for. And then about a year later, the husband / father of this family showed up, and it's a long, complicated story why he couldn't be there at the first place. Goes to the persecution that they were trying to get away from. But I remember, they kind of became mentors to me and my wife. We got married, and my wife Diana and I got married in the midst of, after meeting them, but before the husband showed up. And I remember at one point they were over at our house for dinner, and they said, well, you guys have been married for like more than a year now. When are you gonna have kids? Which is like culturally, by the way, not really an appropriate thing to ask. We would probably, like, it's just, we don't really ask that in our society. But, we explained we would love to have kids. Since we got married, we sort of thought we'd have kids, and, we've been married a year and Diana's not pregnant. And I don't, we don't know why that is. We don't know if that's going to happen. Maybe this isn't God's plan for us, but maybe you could pray for us, which is kind of a nice, like, suburban Christian thing to say. And it's a few months later, this time we were at their house for dinner, and we got to share with them the good news that Diana was pregnant. And I will never forget the moment sitting in their kitchen, eating this kind of like ground, I don't even know what it is, corn mush stuff that is very popular in East Africa, that we explained to them. They're the first people we told, before our parents, before anyone else, before you're supposed to tell people you're pregnant, because like it might not work or whatever. And they literally fell down on the ground, like prostrate in their kitchen, shouting all sorts of Jesus and Alleluias. I have no idea what they're saying, but clearly praising God. And they went on and told us they had been getting up early every day for months, not every day, but every Thursday, and fasting all day on Thursdays to pray that God would bless us with a child. And I still get kind of teary. This is, my daughter Zipporah is 8 now, so this is a while ago. And by the way, we've had our 4th child, and I need to tell them to stop praying because we're good. I think it's such a testament. Like, I offer to pray for people, and I'm doing well if I'm not lying to say I'll pray for you once. They said, oh, we'll pray for you. And they spent their Thursdays praying for us. And I have no doubt that our daughter is an answer to their prayer, more so than an answer to our prayer, because we weren't that faithful with prayer.
Yeah, we had 3 asylum seekers staying in our house for 48 hours, and they were 1 woman from Guatemala and 2 women from Haiti, who during the 2010 hurricane got resettled as refugees in Guatemala, and had been stuck in this camp for, at that point, almost 8 years, and had made this journey. And one of the women had her husband was, and she had twins and her husband, and they were coming together, and got separated in Mexico at some point, where essentially half the group was caught by authorities and detained, and the other half was able to get to the border to request asylum. And so she had one of her twins there, and was kind of just talking at our dining room table with these other women around, and we're translating because they're speaking it's not quite Spanish, and it's not quite Creole. My husband's actually Haitian. It's not quite Creole. It's not quite Spanish. It's like this unique Guatemalan dialect, and they've been in the camps for so long at that point that they were kind of had this mixed language. And this woman is just talking about the feeling of the night before, with her husband trying to pick which kid to take with her, which of the twins, and just, lamenting. And just in the middle of her lament, just breaks out into this beautiful song of praise to God for preserving her life, and just begging him to meet wherever her husband and daughter is, that they would be reunited soon. And these other women just start worshiping God at our dining room table and crying out in prayer for her. And it was just this mixture of total lament and brokenness and total joy and confidence that God was holding them together. And, and that's one of, hundreds of stories like that, where there's just these these tragic choices that have to be made, and yet like this confidence that God sees, God hears. And it's interesting because the day before I was meeting with some young college students who grew up in a very different environment. And so often with, these college students, their questions are like, why does God allow evil to happen? Why is God let people suffer? It's coming from a place of questioning God. And yet so much of like the church in the margins, it's like confidence in God because of their suffering that he's held them through. And just the contrast of those two was like another reminder of like how much the American Western church like needs the faith and prayer and vision of God that the global South has to offer. I saw someone has a question about Neighbor's Table. Do you want to go ahead and ask that? I think we have 2 minutes left before they bounce us back.
I'm Leanne, and I live in Gilbert, and I'm super excited to meet you in person sometime, Dennae. And thank you both for your time this morning. It's just been really amazing. So my question is, does Neighbor's Table also apply to, do you have a format that also applies to just proximity with non-whites, or is it specific to an immigrant population? And then my second question is, if a congregation is considering implementing something like that, do you recommend that we go through a formal time of training and teaching and learning before moving into something like that?
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat. If you're in Arizona, we run the program with a whole bunch of churches together because a lot of churches don't have the diversity built in. And so we can kind of pull on the network that we have. So if you're in Arizona, it's a lot easier to get you involved. If you're in a different city, we'll have to give you the model and kind of do a train the trainer. But yeah, we have 3 tables. One is specific on immigration. Another one that's actually starting in 2 weeks, but we do it several times a year. It's called One Family. And it's about creating a culture of belonging and learning how to be a cross-cultural disciple. And race is one of the big ones that we're addressing. So we read John Perkins' book. I'm drawing a blank. It's like his manifesto. So that's one of the books we read. And then we dig into all kinds of issues related to gender, disability, immigration, socioeconomic poverty. Like, what are the different lines of division in our culture, and how do we as a church be attentive to who's not present and create a culture of belonging? So that would be the one that probably fits more what you're talking about. So we have a few different ones that are kind of running at all times. So email me and we'll connect you. And it's a lot of fun. It's my favorite thing that we do.
How long have you guys been doing Neighbor's Table?
We've done a pilot the last 3 years. And then right before COVID was the first time we started growing it. Like, we kind of like published the curriculum. We do the immigrant table with Neighborhood Ministries, who you guys might be familiar with. They're really the leaders of a lot of our work here locally. So we just started ramping it back up now that it's hard to do virtually. But we tried a little bit, but it's not quite the same.
Thank you.
Maybe
And Emily,